to welcome you all to our first seminar in our series on peatlands and the water environment. We've co-organised it along with the Environment Agency, and the first seminar is going to be looking at the importance of peatlands in delivering water quality. We've got a really good lineup of speakers here from across the UK today, and I'd like to extend all of them our thanks for presenting. Just a quick housekeeping before I hand over to my colleague Mary Berry at the Environment Agency. I'll just put the outline up for you. So as you can see, we'll have our first two speakers, followed by a quick comfort break. We'll reconvene promptly for our final two speakers. We're going to follow that with a Q&A. Our speakers will be recorded and the Q&A will be unrecorded. We have got quite a large audience today, so we've disabled the chat function. And we ask that you put the questions in the Q&A box, and please put the name of the speaker to whom it is addressed for us to direct the questions more efficiently in the Q&A. The Q&A box should be visible to all. So if you would like to see particular questions answered, then please can you upvote them. If you've got questions for either the IUCN or the EA, then if you could please forward those directly to our contact emails, which we'll give shortly, and we'll follow up with you directly. So I'm going to hand over to Mary.
Hello everyone and welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Mary Berry and I am a peatland advisor in the Environment Agency's National Peatland team. We've been working with the IUCN to bring this series of seminars forward, focusing on the importance of water and the water environment, both within and arising from peatlands. So thanks so much, IUCN, for co-organising and sorting so much of this out. The Environment Agency is a regulatory, advisory and delivery body with a statutory remit over water quality. As such, the Environment Agency is responsible for the monitoring of water body health through the Water Environment Regulations 2017, also known as the Water Framework Directive. The Environment Agency has statutory duties towards protected sites and biodiversity, permitting and regulation of water resources, as well as working closely with Ofwat and the water industry to negotiate actions in the price review cycle. This combination of industry and environmental remit means we have an interest in addressing issues of water quality in peatlands in a holistic way. The EA's national peatland team are currently looking at our most up-to-date data and assessing which WFD failures could be linked to peatlands, and we're recording them as such. We want this to inform river basin management plans, which will support evidence for the price review process, local projects and beyond. We're working closely internally with the price review team within EA, as well as with water companies to make it easier to achieve peatland restoration works, which benefit water quality, customer outcomes and the wider water environment. We're really looking forward to the delivery of AMP8 and the peatland projects within it, and the development of the next cycle of the Water Industry National Environment Programme, where we hope to see even more peatland projects brought forward to enhance the water environment. We're also funding research into lowland agricultural peatland water quality, which is due to report in March 2025, and it aims to gather a baseline understanding of water quality surrounding rewetting of agricultural peatlands. In the uplands, we're funding data collection using SONS through an excellent partnership within the Reed catchment in Northumberland, which looks to assess how peatland water quality is impacting freshwater pearl mussels. We're keen to develop research on water quality further, and we'll continue to expand on opportunities in the future. We recognise the significance of collaboration and continue to welcome discussion and debate in this research field. So please get in touch via the email on the screen. If you have any questions to do with anything I've just mentioned, I'd be more than happy to hear from you and really look forward to you getting in touch. Finally, the Environment Agency is excited to welcome a range of speakers covering peatland topics that impact the water environment, people, nature and industry. So a huge thank you to IUCN for hosting and co-organising. A massive thank you to our incredible speakers who are joining us today. And thanks also everyone for coming along to listen, learn and hopefully share some interesting questions later on. With that, I would like to welcome our first speaker, Liam Godwin, who is from the Environmental Research Institute at the University of Highlands and Islands. Liam, if you're ready to share your screen, do you want to kick the show off?
Cool. I'm sure hopefully everyone can see that.
Yeah, looking good.
Cool, thank you for the introduction, Mary. So my name's Liam Godwin, and I'll be talking to you today about peatland restoration in the flow country. and how this influences water quality and the ecology. There we go. So first, who am I? And where is the flow country, if you've not heard of it? I work in the Environmental Research Institute, which is part of the UHI, the University of the Highlands and Islands, based in Fìor-Berry, which is in the far north of Scotland. I work directly under Roxanne Anderson, who's a professor of peatland science and the head of the peatland theme at ERI. And my PhD was on river ecology, mainly looking at Atlantic salmon habitat, peatland restoration and water quality in this area of the flow country, which is this large area of blanket bog in Scotland. As you can see, it is a massive area of blanket bog, which is recently been recognized as the largest blanket bog in Europe, and it covers about 4,000 square kilometers, or 400,000 hectares, or 1,500 square miles if you're into old money. And it's was recently made UNESCO World Heritage Site, as it's considered an outstanding example of actively accumulating blanket bog landscape. And so it's been accumulating for about 9,000 years, according to some estimates, and in places the peat thickness can reach about 8 meters. And around 73% of it already is in high-level statutory protection for domestic law, such as triple SIs or SACs or SPAs and lots of other acronyms. And it derives its name from a Scots word flow or fleur, meaning like a wet peat bog. I should probably have been talking these through at the same time. This is just going back over what I was saying, but with much nicer pictures. And we've got some really nice birds and wild native species that live here. I've included birds as there's a large RSPB nature reserve here called False-Nard Flows, which has been very important for the protection of this landscape that I'll be talking to you about later. But this site hasn't been without its impacts. So there was an NCC peatland survey of Caithness and Sutherland, and they found that there were areas where drainage was affecting it, about 27.8%, but this tended to be quite wide-spaced in like moor grips. Then in the 1970s and 80s, we started to get conifer plantations, which is on about 17% of the landscape. And there's a small areas that have been used historically as peat cutting. And there's a few other impacts, such as there's a few areas that have had some kind of burning, but burning is much less common now in the modern day. But what I'm mainly going to be talking to you about is draining and drain blocking, and then peatland restoration in terms of forest to bog. So a lot of these areas are now being drain blocked, and the aim of this is to prevent these drainage features, which would have been drains or called grips, and it's to reinstate a more natural hydrology and retain the water on the landscape in the peatland. However, that's to raise the water table, and you create these kind of shallow pools where you block these drains. And you often use different kind of dams in lots of different studies and different places. People have used different kind of dams. In the flow country now, it's very common to use peat dams, where you take peat from the side and you place it in the dam to block it, and then you smooth the edges of the drain. But other dams like plastic piling or wooden dams have been used. And since 1995, they've blocked a lot of drains in the flow country. They've blocked over 15,000 hectares with about 16,000 dams. And they've also removed non-native conifer plantations from about 2,300 hectares. And I'm going to start telling you about how this has impacted water quality by telling you about this river in South Caithness, which is called the Langwell Water. And this is one of my case studies that I used in my PhD. And this is a really interesting river because almost all of the drains in this landscape have been blocked now in the entire catchment, and which is really interesting because they didn't have much conifer plantation, so it's a good control group. So what I did is I looked at these few different restoration periods, and I also went around all of the rivers collecting water samples for a few years and then down the main river body. And then I just looked at how these varied in a number of water quality metrics. I also categorized some of these areas because not every stream is drained to the same amount. You can see that some drains, some catchments in these streams are drained, almost the entire catchment will have a lot of drainage in it. Some of them will have a little bit, but some of them couldn't be actually drain blocked, because sometimes when you have a risk of peat slide, you don't want to actually do too much active landscape restoration, because you could risk like destabilizing that peat. So a few areas unfortunately have had to be avoided now, and I'm sure they'll maybe try and come back to them later. So my main findings were that for a few water quality metrics, we found that we had autumnal flushes, which is kind of like where you get the first big kind of rainfall after a year of it being relatively dry in Scotland in the summertime, where the water table rises, and then you kind of get this flush of different water quality metrics out of the peatland. And we mainly saw that for DOC, color meaning like absorbance, and iron and sulfur. And these were kind of ubiquitous across a lot of the stream types. So we saw, not skip ahead too soon, and this was kind of ubiquitous across all of the streams, irrelevant of kind of their drainage state. You do see that maybe iron drained a bit less from the near natural undrained streams, but these were all relatively, within limits of each other, and there wasn't too much concern, which is surprising because sometimes these studies find that you have like big changes of DOC and things. But what was also interesting is we seem to find that there were also very large summer peaks, where we noticed that pH and potassium didn't appear to be affected by drainage. They all kind of moved collectively. They weren't really significantly different from each other. But then things like phosphate and then the E2, E3 ratio, which is kind of a ratio of two colors, which is kind of telling you about the quality and quantity of the different types of carbon coming out of the peatland. And magnesium, these appear to be affected by drainage because they were peaking in the drain streams, but almost as soon as any restoration work had been done, the kind of export from the catchment was reduced quite a lot. And these are dark purple lines of the streams that are still actively drained. But then what was also interesting is we found that there were some streams that seemed to be affected by restoration. So in the years following restoration, they actually seemed to either peak or increase in these values. So things like suva and calcium and manganese all showed that restored streams varied both in the drained and the near natural streams, implying that like this kind of restoration had influenced the water quality, at least in the short term. And then we would probably maybe expect that these values would return back to near natural or drained levels after a while. Things like manganese export, that's often associated with things like disturbance to the underlying mineral layer. So I think it's probably the fact that you've had these kind of large vehicles on the peatland and that you've been digging up bits of peat to place it, you can disturb the underlying mineral layer. And I think that's probably quite likely that a lot of these things have been disturbed in that way. And things like suva, again, are demonstrating that you have kind of a change in where the carbon is being sourced in the stream. So this can come from like rewetting, where you get like a different level of like fulvic and humic acids coming out into the stream water based on like the decomposition position. As like the water level increases, then you start flushing this more decomposed carbon out. So in summary, for drainage anyway, what I really found is that it didn't have a significant impact on water quality in the Langwell catchment anyway. So they had quite, you can see that it's quite a large impact, and I did a river study as well, but we did not find significant differences in water quality in the study. And our water quality for the drained and the drain block streams were actually still quite close to what would be considered near natural stream water quality variables for this kind of area of Scotland. because often these values in the flow country are sometimes our degraded streams are still pretty good quality because of just a lack of human influence over in the past. So our disturbed streams are sometimes as good as near natural streams in other regions of the UK. But we did find that the water quality was strongly influenced by the climate and like the annual cyclings of the seasons. So it's really important that you make sure that any monitoring is over the year, and that we wanted to talk about how the Langall catchment was relatively undisturbed, because a lot of these drains weren't hadn't actively been redug in probably the last 50 years. So it does show that low impacted catchments can be restored with little water quality concern to the ecology, because I also looked at, how any of these water quality changes would have affected the ecology, but none of them ever breached any kind of limit. And most of the Langall was almost always a high water quality according to like SEPA metrics. So now I'm going to talk to you slightly a bit more on forest to bog, which is kind of the other big land use change that's happening in the flow country. And this is where you have a plantation forest. Often in Scotland, it's the non-native conifer species that has been planted onto what was once open peatland habitat. And it's going to be restored back to hopefully recover that kind of like peatland structure, function and biodiversity. So plantation forestry on blanket bog is now largely historical, mainly due to the profound impact it has on the peatland landscape and the biodiversity, and the fact that it can actually be like a carbon source rather than a carbon sink, which is often surprising to people who don't often think about peatlands in some ways. But forest to bog restoration has also advanced in the last 30 years, but it's still more complex, expensive, and intense than drain blocking. So if we're going to have any kind of water quality problems, it's more likely that in the flow country it will come from forest to bog restoration. So to give a quick summary, you have near natural bog for the last 9,000 years. And then in the 1980s, due to changes of the forestry practice, we had large areas were planted with these two non-native species, mainly Sitka spruce and lodgepole pine, neither of which of these trees are actually native to Scotland. I think Sitka spruce is native to Norway and Scandinavia, and then lodgepole pine is North America. And then in the 2000s and 2010s, we had two big periods of tree felling and peatland restoration. And this was due to different two restoration methods that were funded by EU Life Nature grants and was mainly done by RSPB Forsenard. And then in the 2010s, we also had some extra work, because what happened in the 2000s is they did some initial work, but then they were always planning to come back in 2010 to do kind of secondary intervention, like extra drain blocking or anything that needed to be done to go over the site. But it was always planned that they would revisit and deal with any on-site brash once it had time to slightly decay. And then the question is, have these places recovered? Are there many measurable features? Are they sequestering carbon again? People think that mainly this happened in 20 years, but there's problems in all of these situations where it's not a very rapid thing, and it really depends on like how you measure it. But I mainly found that there were two groups that I could fit most of the restoration areas into. We have fell to waste, and we have enhanced felling, and that's just the terms I use for them to kind of group in quite a large group of different activities, because they did do restoration in a lot of different experimental ways. But the big two main groups were in the 2000s when they did fell to waste. That's where the trees were younger, they felled the trees, the brash and stems were left in situ. And then in the 2010s, they basically came back and crushed it to try and make the landscape more flat. And in these sites, just because they're older, you see a lot more revegetation of the site, but it's mainly Molinia or purple moorgrass and sedges like deergrass. There are mosses, but they're not as abundant as you'd find in near natural streams, in near natural peatlands. And they're mainly restricted to like the hollows. And then enhanced felling is kind of the more recent technique. And this is where we've had, you have much more active restoration. So it's kind of the trees are cut down and then they're also mulched, and then a lot more wood is removed because they've had 10 more years to grow. So some of that wood is actually harvestable. And then they kind of smooth the surface because they don't want to have this kind of hollowed artificial feature that we got in the fell to waste, where you kind of don't get the moss recolonization. So far, it's had little revegetation, but it's also still quite recent. Like they've only just kind of stopped doing the secondary intervention on a lot of these sites, as it takes quite a long time to go over everything. And in summary, I'm going to go through them a little bit at a time, but we're going to talk about the ecology a bit more in these ones. What I found is fell to waste. It wasn't really significantly different in terms of water quality from near natural streams, showing that the fact that even though it's revegetated and it's not really the same kind of vegetation community as a near natural peat bog yet, it might get there one day, it's still effectively regulating the water quality enough after, roughly 20 years of peatland restoration. The enhanced felling tends to be significantly higher. I've given the values just for anyone who's really interested, but these are values where they're significantly higher than the near natural streams. And it's tended to be higher in a lot of nutrients, which are probably leaching from the decaying brash. And then we also find that things like DOC and color and organic sediments tended to be quite high. And that was probably more of a concern to like the ecology, but we'll go into that. And it's really showing that, things like deeper peat water and increased decay, and a lot of this has probably also happened in the fell to waste sites, but I wasn't there in the 2000s when they were restoring it at first. So really it's kind of hard, and don't have the takeaway that enhanced felling is inherently worse, because a lot of this probably also happened in fell to waste, but I just wasn't there to measure it at the time. But what was interesting, because I was interested in the ecology of these sites, is I wanted to look at the macroinvertebrates, so like large insects that live in the freshwater environment that you can see with your eye. And I wanted to see how and if they were affected by the restoration work that was happening. And basically I did a lot of kick samples. I gathered the invertebrates, I identified them, I put them into their broad categories, and we found that while there were differences, and there were big differences between streams as well, it didn't seem to depend so much on water quality or the kind of catchment land use. It seemed to vary more based on the substrate that was actually in the stream. So I think it would be nice to do more streams, but unfortunately there aren't. If I wanted streams that had almost all the same land use, it's very hard to group them. Or find streams that only have one land use to group them to do anything more powerful. But what we really found is just streams were more variable within each other. There did tend to be a few more individuals in the fell to waste streams and the near natural streams, but there wasn't actually like a significant difference when we looked into it. And this was actually kind of surprising because we had expected more differences, because there's been a previous study by Ramchandra who had found a bigger difference between drained and restored streams, and that was due in their eyes to suspended sediments and fine particulate organic matter. But then I looked into kind of their water quality variables, and they found that sediment values in their near natural streams were higher than our disturbed streams. So even though we have these big forest to bog operations happening in our streams, their kind of export of organic sediments was still much higher than we had from our streams. And that's probably due to like the restoration work had a lot of sediment traps in it. So while it was still bigger than the natural streams, it maybe wasn't at a threshold enough to cause kind of an ecological change. And this kind of demonstrates that we need to ensure that different places, so their study was in the Pennine Moors and we're in the flow country, and that these kind of different areas will have different levels of naturalness depending on their history and land use, because the Pennine Moors have a much higher level of human intervention, such as, like pollution from the Industrial Revolution or acid rain or far more significant burning than happened in the flow country. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, I'm well aware that I might go over time, so I'll quickly skip through. But I also looked in the main river channel, and we found that phosphate increased significantly when there was felling upstream. But it did drop and diluted quite rapidly. While the river dike, which is on the left, did increase, it did rapidly dilute when you got to this large kind of Halladale River that was downstream of it. But the concentration for phosphate in the river, even though this was significantly influenced by the enhanced felling, the water quality would still have been classed as high for Atlantic salmon, which is really what people were concerned about, because this is like a big red spawning area for Atlantic salmon. So this is kind of a win, as even though it's significantly different, it doesn't mean it's ecologically different. Organic suspended sediments did the same, but you see that there's a much different pattern here where it seems like organic suspended sediments are peaking much lower down in the river, but not around the forest to bog restoration. And then I later found out that this is probably because there's this kind of big area of quite actually intensive drainage for the flow country. And I think there's kind of a lot of sumping and wasting that's happening up there where organic sediments are coming in. And that is actually kind of fine. It would be nice if it was restored, but see, the thing is we have salmon reds, which are much higher upstream, where the organic sediment actually doesn't seem to be at risk of smothering the fish eggs that are down there. And then the Halladale also rapidly diluted this organic sediment. The only other concern that I have is that the temperatures in the river dike and the Halladale were not influenced by the change in the land use. But the Halladale had an average, had a maximum value of about 19.2 degrees. The dike temperature, however, was getting to moderate quality, because it should not really exceed 20 degrees. And Atlantic salmon start to become firmly stressed at 23. And there were periods where the salmon were going to be experiencing water temperatures of about 24 degrees. And this is quite concerning because we're going to see these small tributaries in the uplands can be at least warming by about 4 degrees by 2070. And that's when we're going to start having much higher risk of low flows and high water temperatures that could actually be quite catastrophic for them. There is possible solutions. There are places where native riparian woodland could attempt to mitigate by shading some of the river, because we have a lot of loss of woodland up in Caithness and Sutherland and around the flow country. I wanted to prove this by going to some of these small tributaries which are named after trees. So this is a big burn called the Great Bog Stream of the Rowan. However, I went and had a look, and I've been to a few of these places which are all named after this, but this one didn't seem to have a tree closer than about 10 kilometers. And when you kind of look at it, you see that the burn of the Rowan on the left, and then you can see this is the Armadale burn on the right. And you see that where you've had more active landscape management, where you've been able to build fences to exclude deer, because we have a very large deer population up here where they maybe overgraze, you do get some riparian vegetation that isn't invasive of the bog, because they're not bog colonizing species, as they're things like birch, oak, and rowan and willow. And this has shown that, we can, with changes to maybe some grazing practice, we could offer a solution to that potential problem in future. And probably the forest of any kind of woodland riparian planting should really be focused on upland areas before the rivers, where they're much more reduced by things like groundwater, where cooler groundwater is coming in to help diminish any kind of impact from sunlight coming in. I'm afraid I'm slightly over time, but that is the end. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Liam. Okay, I'll hand over quickly to our next speaker, which is Joseph Margetts from the Moors for the Future Partnership.
Morning, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen, so let me know if you can see it. Is that working?
Yeah, I can see that.
Brilliant. So, as I said, my name's Joe. I'm a Senior Research and Monitoring Officer at Moors for the Future Partnership, a peat partnership based in the Peat District. And I just wanted to talk to you about some of the work we've done around sediment generation and transport on Kinder Scout in the Peat District. So it's a site that's been heavily degraded, and probably the blanket bog in this area is some of the most degraded in the country. So quite a contrast to the flow country which we were just looking at. This is the area that I'm going to be talking about today. This is the north edge of Kinder Scouts. It's quite an iconic area in the Peat District. It's the highest point, 636 metres. We've got 3 experimental mini catchments set up on this plateau, which have yielded some really interesting information over the years. So just to sort of orientate you, the one on the right in the red square is our bare peat control site, where we've made no interventions. And the 2 small green catchments on the left are treatment catchments. And I'll talk more about what we've done there in a minute. This is a picture of our bare peat control catchment in 2011. As you can see, there are huge areas of bare peat where that vegetation has been lost. And as Liam alluded to, probably kick-started by atmospheric pollution deposition from the Industrial Revolution, as we're surrounded by many big cities and towns in this area, and then exacerbated by things like wildfires and other factors over the years. So this really demonstrates how fragile that peat surface is. So if you look at the bit I've circled in red there, you can see a little hag top remaining there and a couple of dip wells sticking out of the peat. If I move on by 9 years, and I'll flick back and forward between them, you can see how much of that peat surface is being lost. So really quite rapid erosion happening as it's exposed to water, drying out, exposed to wind in summer and freeze thaw action. And this landscape is incredibly gullied. So this is one of the streams on that site known as Fìor-Berry. Back in 2021, and you can easily see from that picture how huge amounts of sediment are being transported down the catchment. So erosion is a real problem, and trying to address that was one of the initial drivers of the restoration work that's happened in this area. Luckily, we've been able to carry on monitoring these catchments for a long time. So starting in 2010. Around then, through various different projects funded by water companies and EU Life projects, and currently by Severn Trent Water, as this flows into their Bamford catchment. We've been able to have some really interesting findings. So this is one of the treatment catchments back in 2011. So as I said, we've got these 3 mini catchments. They're all about 1 hectare in size, with various monitoring equipment in, and this is shortly after the initial revegetation treatment had been applied. So that was heather brash spread over the surface, and then lime to raise the pH, grass seeds to stabilize the surface, and fertilizer just to give those grass seeds a bit of a kickstart. And back when this was done, what we wanted to do was measure how that affected the sediment transported down those flow pathways. So this was based on work that was done by Emma Shuttleworth at University of Manchester. She'd previously used these what we call TIMS units, which stands for Time Integrated Mass Flux Samplers. Sounds very complicated, and indeed her units were more complicated, with sensors in for looking at when water was flowing through them. We used a simplified version, so I'll just refer to them as sediment traps from now. And they're basically plastic pipes with polystyrene chips in and a mesh over the end that can be laid in a flow pathway like this, and for a set amount of time, and then we can remove them, take them to a lab, and carefully rinse the particles that are captured with deionized water, and then filter it and dry it in the oven, and then we can weigh it. And then you can calculate carbon by doing loss on ignition as well. So in this experiment, there were 10 of these units set up in each of the mini catchments. And they were placed in very similar areas where we were trying to match the gully size and the depth and the slope to try and make them as similar as possible. And they were in there for a fixed amount of time, as I said. And these are the results from that initial work done back in the early 2010s. So the box on the left is the bare peat control site, and the mean set to 100%, and then you can see the difference of the sediment generated 18 months after that initial revegetation. So it's a huge drop of around about 97% from these samples. And why is that important? Well, obviously the loss of carbon is the thing that springs to mind, and we think that maybe about 70% of that fluvial carbon loss is from particulates rather than dissolved carbon. But also, if you think about the expense of water companies treating that water, so all those particles are ending up in the reservoirs. In this catchment, that would be down in the Howden, Derwent and Ladybower reservoirs, which leads to the Bamford treatment works. And I know that tankering away of that sludge, it has really significant costs for them. So obviously that's a very good reason to be trying to turn off that flow of sediment. And also something you might not have thought about immediately, but it's mobilizing those toxic heavy metals that were deposited through that atmospheric pollution that I talked about earlier. So that's things like lead and copper and zinc. So that's another problem really. And as Liam was suggesting in the last talk, we'd expect climate change to make this process worse and speed up this erosion through larger storm events, for example, and hot temperatures. So trying to halt this process is really, really important. This is a fixed point, so that's the same photo view that I showed a minute ago, but in 2020. So you can see the vegetation in that catchment has matured a lot. We've got some dwarf shrubs and mosses coming in, and there's also some grasses and rushes and things still there. And the other catchment, the third one, is what we've called Nogson. That had a lot of sphagnum moss introduced and also gully blocking done to it. And the sphagnum moss has done amazingly well in that catchment. So you can see there over 3 or 4 years, the photos on the left are when those plugs were planted, and photos on the right are how they've changed. So in certain areas within that mini catchment, the sphagnum's done really well. And we've actually mapped that. And I don't know if you can see this very well, but we've tried to estimate the sphagnum cover in sections of all the flow pathways across that catchment. And you can see that change just in those few short years. And that's an image from Apple Maps aerial view. You can see that sphagnum really clearly. This is from a couple of years ago. And that's our estimate of how it's developed. So in the flow pathways within that mini catchment, we've got almost complete coverage of sphagnum, something 90+%. And on the slopes, next to those flow pathways, we've got something like 35% cover now. So it's done really well. So what we wanted to do was try and quantify whether that had an additional benefit compared to just the revegetation. So before I get onto that, I just wanted to show you something for a bit of context. So on those catchments, we've not only measured sediment movement, but we've measured stream flow, rainfall, water table, amongst other things, vegetation change. So that sphagnum addition has had significant effects on the behaviour of flow after storms. So you can see it before restoration on the left there, all 3 mini catchments behaving very similarly in that storm. So the rainfalls at the top there, inverted. And then after that restoration process, the pattern completely changes. So the black graph is still the control catchment where nothing's changed. Looks very, very similar. The green line is the site that was revegetated. So you can see a reduction in the peak discharge and an increase in the lag time. And the blue catchment is the heavily sphagnum dominated one. And you can see a huge reduction in the peak discharge from that storm and a very lengthened lag time. So going from 30 minutes on the bare peat control, which stayed the same throughout the whole time for this in this example, and up to 200 minutes for the sphagnum dominated site. So it's had a really significant effect on how water is behaving across that site. So we redeployed some of these units in 2020 for 2 periods, so 50 days across all the 3 catchments, and then for 172 days on the 2 catchments with vegetation. And that was because we were expecting the bare peat units to be overwhelmed after about 50 days. So we wouldn't then be able to compare it. So we just did a comparison of the 2 other catchments for the longer time period. And that's me helping to install some of the units. And I think, here we go. This is a video I want to quickly show you of my colleague Tom collecting them in and explaining why we were doing what we were doing. So I'll see if this works.
I think we've lost the sound there, Joe. It's frozen for most people.
Right. Okay. Can you still hear me?
We can hear you. Yeah, it's the video.
Yeah. Okay. I'll just try that again. Is that working or is it still frozen?
Yeah, it's still frozen.
Okay. Well, don't worry. I'll just continue on. Sorry about that. I did wonder if that might happen because it's quite a large
That's all right.
file. But basically, I thought it'd be good to show a bit of video of in situ so you can get a good idea of what the site's like and what Tom's doing there. Basically, removing those units and having a look inside to eyeball them before sending them off for analysis. And basically what we found when we first removed them is that you can't really see any sediment at all in them, just a few strands of sphagnum, compared to the just revegetated site where you could see small amounts of sediment, but very insignificant compared to the bare peat control site. And I'll skip on now to show you the results of that. So for the 50-day deployment, the initial one, we saw very similar results from the previous time, in that we had about a mean of 10 grams of sediment from the bare peat control site over that period, compared to 0.21 for the revegetated site and 0.01 for the revegetated gully butt and sphagnum site. So absolutely tiny amount compared to the bare peat site, which is what we'd expect really. But we then compared the 2 revegetated versus sphagnum sites over a longer period to see if there was a difference, and there was. So it was a further 95% reduction compared to just revegetated. So basically the sediment transport had been turned almost completely off, through that process. The amounts collected from the sphagnum-dominated site were so small that we weren't able to perform loss on ignition. So that's why I'm talking about sediment rather than carbon. But on the samples where we could perform loss on ignition from the other sites, the content was mostly peat, hardly any mineral in it at all. So we could assume that that amount represents peat. So that was the end of this process, really, that I wanted to talk to you about. So we've gone over 11 years from a site looking like that, very deeply gullied, lots and lots of bare peat, to a site that's got a lot of sphagnum in. And we're assuming a 99.9% reduction in sediment transport as a result of that restoration work, which is quite good, I think. So that was it from me, really. So quite a simple little study, but I thought really interesting because of the hugely significant results.
Okay.
I'll stop going there.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks, Joseph. That's fab. Okay. I really, yeah, brilliant presentations from Joe and Liam there. So we're just going to take a quick 5-minute comfort break. So if we could all return promptly at 10:55, let you have a quick break, and then we'll have our next two presenters. Thank you.
Okay. Firstly, thank you for the opportunity to present here. What I'd like to do here today is look at peatland ecology and, as the title suggests, aquatic impacts, but perhaps from a bit of a different slant to the previous speakers. In as much as that, I'd like to focus a bit more on geological and hydrogeological impacts on water quality and how that affects aquatic ecosystems. So most of the work I'm going to present here was based in the Republic of Ireland, even though I myself am based in Northern Ireland, but of course the principles still remain the same. So across Ireland, we have sort of quite a lot of peatlands. Just for clarity's sake, what we're considering as peat here is something that is greater than 30% dry organic matter by dry weight. In the Irish context, of course, that can be much higher. And then basically, when we're looking at peatlands themselves as well, we need to basically specify a threshold. And typically that threshold in the past was anything from 50 centimeters to 35 centimeters on drained peatlands. Now, the UNEP has basically specified that probably it's better to consider 10 centimeters as the threshold for peatlands. And what we'll see here is that if we go with that 10 centimeter threshold, this is the most recent peatland map of the Republic of Ireland that was just generated last year. And what we see is we really have quite a significant amount of coverage, nearly a quarter if you go with the 10 centimeter threshold. That of course declines as the threshold gets thicker to about 1/6. We have, of course, then we've got a lot of rain, and that gives us the specialized plant communities and the bogs that we see. And we're basically looking at two types of bog, raised bog and blanket bog. They form part of a continuum. It's not as if one just stops and another then starts. So as we go further west, we see that transition from raised bog into blanket bog. I'm going to focus on blanket bog in this particular presentation. That occupies about 12% or roughly 1/8 of the area of the Republic of Ireland. So really quite extensive coverage. And it's that thicker sequences of peat that I'm looking at. By the way, the proportions in Northern Ireland are broadly similar to what we see in terms of raised bog and blanket bog in the Republic of Ireland. So what are we actually dealing with? Well, with blanket bog, we're looking at areas where we've got that higher rainfall, and critically, that rainfall occurs all year round. And our conceptual model, our concept, the geological concept of what these things actually are, up until relatively recently, was this idea that we had a layer of peat over pretty much a layer of bedrock or thick glacial soils that really weren't involved in the whole process of groundwater flow coming into peat, and the underlying materials really didn't have much of an interchange between one another. Hopefully what we'll see later, hopefully what you'll agree when we look at the data later, is that was actually quite incorrect. we have these waterlogged conditions, as we've seen already, and that slows vegetation degradation rates. And in Ireland, we typically have between 2 and 4 meters. Though, just like what was mentioned there by the first speaker there, we basically can't get much thicker sequences. I myself have measured up to 9 meters, and that's essentially a blanket, raised bog core, if you will. And as the bog develops, it spreads out the blanket, the landscape. We've got this bog water, which is acidic, very poorly mineralized, very low specific electrical conductivity, but as we've seen already with the previous speakers, very high in can be very high in dissolved organic carbon. Most of this water drains to low water streams, and as we'll see in a moment, these contain quite important aquatic ecosystems. Now, in terms of, despite the extensive coverage and unlike situation over large parts of Scotland, we have really quite widespread blanket bog degradation across the island of Ireland. Within the Republic of Ireland, we have just over nearly 151,000 hectares and 50 sites making up the Special Area of Conservation Network. So that all sounds very reassuring until we see that since 1994, even within the network, we've lost about 10% of what we would consider to be active blanket bog. In other words, peat accumulating vegetation. This was suspected to be an underestimation. And then when we started to look at this in a bit more detail, we carried out a program of tiered screening, starting off with about 1,400 sites, 1,400 catchments where we had blanket bog. And we essentially whittled that down, looking for areas where there was no ostensible impacts visible from aerial imagery. And we basically ended up with 3 locations that had reasonably large catchments. And even there, we did see some evidence of degradation. Put rather soberingly, we have nowhere in the Republic of Ireland, we don't have a single catchment in the Republic of Ireland that is greater than 200 hectares of blanket bog that is not impacted by human activity, despite that extensive coverage. Now, we believe that all of this is causing stress to aquatic ecosystems. And why do we believe that? Well, if we look at these high status water bodies, as defined under the Water Framework Directive, what we actually see is we've got quite an extensive, they're scattered around the country, but we've got quite a number of these. But then when we look at what's going on over time and relate that to peat coverage, what we've seen is that as peat coverage has declined, we get a corresponding reduction in the number of high status water bodies. And why is this? Well, there seems to be a number of elements, and the previous speakers have very nicely touched on a lot of this. But one of the elements that I think we need to consider probably in a bit more detail is stream flow. If you look at what we have changes in land use, and typically that involves drainage, and that of course involves changes to the physical hydrology. In other words, what does the water do in a catchment? We basically have artificial drainage, as we have illustrated in this area of plantation forestry on peat, and that does what it's designed to do. It gets rid of water more quickly than naturally. So we got that water going away very quickly, and as we've seen already very nicely in the previous presentation by Joseph, we've basically got very, very quick responses, peak responses in areas that have been affected by degradation. The other way of looking at this, though, is that water, which would have basically hung around for longer, is also no longer available to sustain base flow in the same quantities. In other words, dry weather flow in the drier periods that follow an event. So we can get at the same location, hopefully people can see this with the image, the photographs here, we have much, much lower flows. And of course, we anticipate that leads to more stressful ecological conditions. If we refer to the previous presentation, you think about those changes in temperature. If you've got a smaller amount of water flowing in a stream, you have less of a buffering capacity. So you're much more sensitive to changes in air temperature. We then can link this physical hydrology to water quality. And when we relate flow to water quality, we start to see a reasonable level of predictability here. So if you take a look, we see this relationship between specific electrical conductance, and that in turn is related to some of the ion content in the water, particularly the calcium. And what we see is that those lower flows we have significantly higher calcium and significantly higher specific electrical conductance. Now, what I would also point out here is that the calcium levels that we're actually seeing at lower flow are significantly higher than anything we see at all in the bog water samples that we collect. So we've basically got something else going on here. Regrettably, the situation with the dissolved volcanic carbon is less clear-cut, but there are some very interesting trends there as well. So, I would also note, as you can see here, that the DOC concentrations in the bog water compared to those that we observe in the stream. And again, just reiterating this idea that we've essentially got very high levels of mineralization in our streams during the low flow conditions. So why do we have that difference between the bog water and the stream water? Well, this is where the geology comes in. If we go back to our original model of blanket bog, we essentially assumed that there was negligible interaction between the bog and the substrate. Now, what's happened over the past few years in Ireland is there's been quite considerable geological investigation. And what we see in many cases is that we have a substrate underneath the peat that is really quite permeable. It doesn't need to be all that thick, but it's quite permeable and it is capable of transmitting quite significant amounts of water. And so this gives rise to a different conceptual model of blanket bog, where we have our peat and we have our underlying thick sequence of bedrock, which can have variable hydraulic permeability as well. But we also have this rubbly horizon, which is capable of taking water from above. Water flows down through that and it reacts. And that reaction gives us that change in water chemistry that we observe. And this basically then affects how the wider hydrology behaves in the bog as well. If we put in water monitoring wells at the water table and then we put them in at the base of the peat, what we see is a systematic, consistent downward gradient, indicating that a proportion of the water in the peat is actually migrating not laterally into the streams, but rather going down vertically before it starts to flow through the substrate material. So this is what's going on over time. If we take a look here, this is just, you can see here, if you look at the dates, we've got if you will, an early summer period in mid to late April 2018. And what we see is this very, very rapid change in water quality that is in response to a rainfall event. So we have an increase in discharge. We then see a corresponding decline in our specific electrical conductance, and that of course is related to the mineral content of the water. Now at high flow, the water quality between a number of different catchments with a number of different substrate geochemistries, in other words, different rock types, different properties, what we see is at peak flow, that water quality is pretty much consistent in every one of those blanket bog covered catchments. But when the flow declines, we start to see these remarkable differences in the stream's chemistry. And so what we see here is, hopefully people can see this rather complex, but is apparently a complex diagram. It's essentially showing the major ion content or the levels of mineralization that we observe. And what we see is we have very, very different water chemistries at low flow, and then as at high flow, they all converge together. So if you follow the arrows, that's showing the direction as we move from low flow to high flow. So at low flow, we have very different chemistries in each of these streams, and that in a way helps to account for the aquatic biodiversity that we observe in many of these low water upland streams, where ostensibly the same type of water and the same flow regimes are operating. But when we start to look at base flow, we see significant differences. So this gives rise to, for the intact blanket bog, gives rise to a revised hydrological model. So instead of everything just flowing through the peat and discharging into the river, what we see instead is we have if you simplify it, we've got a model where we have bog water, but we've also got substrate water. Now, for most of the year, that substrate water is providing a very small proportion of total flow, but it really becomes important during those dry weather periods where the water discharging from the bog basically reduces significantly. And what we see is the proportion of water coming from the substrate materials is significantly higher. giving rise to that those more mineralized conditions that we observe at low flow. Now, that's for the intact system. What about a degraded system? Well, with degradation, what we basically see is the same overall geochemistry in the stream water. There's no big differences, but if you take a look at these plots, and particularly the plot there at the top right-hand side, the straight line, the solid straight line is basically showing if there were no differences between the water quality in the intact and degraded, what we would see is that the water chemistry would fall on that line. And we do see that in the underlying line where we have sodium and chlorine falling pretty much on that line with no real significant difference. On the other hand, calcium, magnesium are above the line. So we've got the same major ion chemistry, but what we have that's different here is that the concentrations are higher. And that's essentially because we're getting a higher proportion of that mineralized water coming out from underneath. So this gives rise to this revised hydrological model of the bog. We essentially have artificial drainage coming in. It basically affects the peat accumulation, but it also rather critically delivers water more quickly than we would observe under natural conditions. And that rapid loss of water, of course, means that there's less water available to stabilize the stream flow at lower flows with that nutrient poor, mineral poor water that we would observe coming from the bog if the bog were intact. On the other hand, the more mineralized material, that continues to discharge pretty much at the same rate. And this basically has some significant implications for biodiversity. At low flow and degraded areas, we see that the artificial drainage gives us those higher proportions that we observe in the stream. And this can lead to problems such as high levels of iron. Regrettably, across many parts of Ireland, the picture that you see here on the right-hand side is all too common. What we've got is we've very heavily mineralized groundwater upwelling. The iron that was dissolved in the groundwater under anaerobic conditions comes into contact with oxygen and precipitates out. That water discharges into receiving streams and other water bodies where there's insufficient flow at low flow to remove it. And so it starts to smother the stream bed and affect the aquatic biota. Now, what we find is that this is a rather temporary thing. When we look at it year on year, there tends to be a large flush that occurs at the end of the summer, at the start of the winter period, and that takes a lot of this away. But the crucial point being here that during that summer period, when conditions are really quite stressful in these streams and other water bodies, we don't have that flushing and we have an accumulation of this iron-rich sediment. And a colleague of mine tells me, for those of you who are interested in freshwater pearl mussels, that this is not good news for freshwater pearl mussels at all. They really do not like iron oxides. So overall, we have greater stress to aquatic ecosystems. Now, where are we going with this from here? Well, the one thing I would stress to everybody present is that, particularly in Ireland, blanket bog hydrology is really the poor cousin of raised bog hydrology, and our understanding of blanket bog hydrology largely is still incomplete. So there's a lot more that needs to be done. But what we found in taking the approach that we've adopted is that if we consider flow and water quality together, we can better understand hydrological processes. We've got significant ongoing research and the application of new sensors and new analytical tools, such as those that I show here on the right-hand side, allow us to develop hypotheses on what hydrological conditions should be operating in particular areas. And with the availabilities of new sensors, telecoms, and new techniques, we're actually able to focus our sampling protocols so we have a more effective use of resources. And that also allows us to identify key areas of concern where we might focus restoration efforts as well. And needless to say, this has considerable potential to be applied elsewhere. So if you'd like to know more, there is a report that is a little bit dated at the moment, but it's freely available, published by the Irish Environmental Protection Agency, report number 378. And needless to say, I just want to acknowledge the support that we've received from the US-Ireland programme in supporting our sensor development measures as well. So I'll leave it at that. So thank you for your attention.
I'll hand over to Kat now. There's Kat Moody from Water at Leeds.
Hi, thanks. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay. So just be able to, yeah, has that worked? Is that the right view?
Yeah.
Excellent, great, thank you. Yeah, as Jess said, I'm Kat Moody from University of Leeds. I currently have a NERC fellowship based on peatlands and organic matter. The work I'm going to mostly talk about today is actually the findings from an industrial innovation fellowship that I've just come to an end, which was again NERC funded, but it was in partnership with water companies in the UK to look at how organic matter is impacting on their drinking water treatment in reservoirs, because they have significant issues with peatlands impacting on their water quality. Millions of people in the UK receive drinking water from reservoirs built on peatland soils, but this is not really just a UK problem. This has been reported in really areas across mostly in the Northern Hemisphere, where the drinking water is often sourced from reservoirs on peat. So Canada, Sweden particularly have problems with this too. Peatlands are significant sources of organic matter and carbon, and this gets into the reservoirs very easily. As previous talks have shown, it's very mobile in water and gets into the reservoirs. This aquatic carbon then has to be removed to comply with well, the EU and UK rules on what we can have in drinking water. So water companies are really adept at removing organic matter. In the past, this is mostly focused on the coloured organic matter that was the problem, and this was coming in. This was very clearly sourced from peatlands, so it was very terrestrial in origin and coming in from peatlands. In the last 30 years or so, there's been increasing concentrations of organic carbon in water, but also alongside that, there's been a change in this composition. They're getting more uncoloured organic matter compounds, so the organic matter is still in the water, but it just isn't having that same kind of brownish colour to it. So there's still a lot of the brown there, but then there's this underlying uncoloured organic matter that's also causing lots of problems for them. So the water companies wanted more information about what organic matter is actually in their reservoirs and where in the catchments it is coming from. So the first part of my study was a really broad spatial study looking at this across UK surface waters. And yes, so this was the spatial study of UK and the Faroe Islands surface waters. The Faroe Islands were included because they have quite similar drinking water issues to the UK, and it turned out no one had really ever looked at the water chemistry of organic soils in the Faroe Islands, so it was a really interesting place to go. And they have very organic soils that have experienced a lot of the similar issues to what we've had in our uplands, so a lot of grazing that have caused a lot of erosion. So this experiment was specifically looking at surface waters in peatlands and highly organic soil areas in September and autumn of these 2 years, 2018, 2019. And I visited 405 individual sites across these 5 areas and 117 catchments. So it's quite a lot of water sampling. I wanted to have within and between catchment variation and looked at lots of different types of water bodies within catchments to see what the water chemistry was doing, but also what the organic matter looked like. So what its composition was in each of these areas to determine the natural background levels of organic matter that water companies are experiencing on a daily basis. One of the interesting things about organic matter is obviously it's terrestrial organic matter is sourced from soils and plants, and so the vegetation cover and land use are quite important in determining this. This is just an example of one of the catchments I included. So if you're familiar with the OS map markings, you would suspect this is all entirely forested, which is true for some parts of it. It is still forested. It's got this conifer plantation around the streams, but it is actually also being deforested in areas. And this is sort of another stream that was left. So the trees were removed, and then nothing more really has been done to it. So it's just been left. It's revegetated quite well. These are both on peat, and then the reservoir is also on peat soils. And so obviously these two streams have quite an impact on what water is getting into the reservoir. And so not only the water, but also the organic matter. And then that impacts the treatment works. Unfortunately, not these treatment works, because that's not the treatment works of that reservoir, but it's close by. But so across these 407 water samples, they could generally be assigned to one of 5 clusters based on their organic matter composition and water chemistry. And then I started looking at what features these clusters had in common to determine which factors about the catchments are impacting on the organic matter. So things like land use, vegetation cover, percentage peat, and catchment areas were generally quite good indicators of the organic matter compositions likely to be present in the water. And then these 5 clusters had very specific things that were quite to each one, with large catchment areas or small catchment areas in each thing, and whether they were more based on islands or more based on mainland being a factor. And these 5 main kind of compositions of organic matter across the whole of the UK and Faroe Islands could then be used so the main sort of outcomes of this is that the water companies can then use this information to start to target more specific organic matter compounds in their waters. So oxygen-rich compounds are more likely to be removed by coagulation. So this would be more effective on sites on organic matters from cluster 2, which come from more, and this research can kind of show where those organic matter compositions are more likely to occur. And then I started to look at more specifics about the land uses within these clusters, and areas with higher disturbance, such as those used for game shooting or sheep grazing or recently felled forestry, had different carbon nitrogen ratios to those in more near natural states, which showed that changing land use can impact on the sort of compounds in the water, but then that also impacts on how much, well, in this example, chlorine demand and the potential for disinfectant byproducts being formed in water. An interesting finding, is more interesting than useful, I think, that there was differences between reservoirs and lakes, so between sort of artificially impounded waters and lakes. But this is possibly just a sampling artifact, unfortunately, because well, reservoirs can occur at any latitude, whereas lakes tend to be found in the more northerly sites in my study, so more in Scotland, and they have smaller catchment areas in the ones I studied. But I'm not the only study to have found differences between lakes and reservoirs, so it's quite interesting. One of the other interesting findings was that reservoirs and lakes are actually doing a good job of buffering the changes in organic matter. So in quite a few of these catchments, I looked at the inlets, the reservoir, and the outlets, and the compositions were quite stable in the lakes and reservoirs. So it was quite good to see that they're actually, well, sort of that will help with water treatment works, but unfortunately also showed quite a large proportion of in lake and in reservoir production of organic matter. And these compounds produced by microbes, algae, etc., are more likely to be the uncolored organic matter that is then causing more problems for drinking water treatment. So generally quite mixed findings, some useful things that can be useful for water companies. But this was just a sort of a snapshot in time. So this was quite a spatial but not over time study. So obviously the next logical step was to do this over a longer time period. So I chose some of these sites to take forward for, the plan was in 2018, the plan was to do it for 4 years. And so some sites would be visited annually, some would be visited quarterly and some monthly over this time period to see how much they varied over the time. So I chose 41 of the sites I'd used in my spatial study to look at this over time. And specifically, I chose them in 4 geographic areas to look at how that varied, how that impacted them over time. And the water companies were particularly interested in their island water supplies because they're quite vulnerable to climate and drought, etc. So if they have any changes, then they have to ship in water to provide that for the local communities. So these are quite vulnerable. So 2 island areas were included in the north of Scotland, and then larger reservoirs in the south of Scotland and a few in England for comparison. So looking at water chemistry, organic matter composition, and then I started doing some more in-depth analysis of this using mass spec analysis. Across these 4 sampling areas, there were some that were sampled annually, and the plan was that groups 1, 2, and 3, so the most northerly sites, would be sampled annually, and this mostly worked. Obviously, there were some gaps in sampling, and we had to readjust timings for this based on lockdowns and maternity leave. And then all sites in group 4 would be visited quarterly and then monthly. So we almost achieved the quarterly, and then actually managed to do monthly in 2021, as they were deemed close enough that we could keep that sampling going. It would have been nice if the weather could have played along as well and kept that consistent over the 4 years. Generally, the air temperatures were quite consistent across the 4 areas. So on the average temperatures are these numbers, large numbers on the map here. So it was 9.8, 11.6, 12.01, and 12.89 in these 4 areas. Unfortunately, the rainfall was quite variable across these 4 years. So we had quite a couple of dry years and a couple of wetter years. And actually that seems to have had quite a lot of impact on the organic matter, which is interesting. So similar to the spatial survey, I found these trends across these 4 areas I was looking at, with different organic matter compositions and different chemical compositions of these across from north to south. This we determined was broadly related to the temperature of these areas, because within that variation there's different land uses and different well, after Raymond's talk, I'm now very worried about their underlying geologies as well. But generally for the peatland sites, they're all quite small, but there are also some similarities across their spread, but there are some significant trends emerging. But the main focus of the study was to look at the differences annually. So all these samples that are included in the annual section are all taken in autumn. So after that, after the summer drought period. And then we see quite a lot of differences across these 4 years, which is interesting. Different chemical compositions occur after in each year across all of these sites. And then starting to look at differences between different years, and then differences in rainfall and air temperatures. So we're seeing that actually the rainfalls were quite similar between 2018 and 2021, as was the air temperature, but we saw very significant differences in, like the majority of significant differences were all in 2021. So starting to think about this as the distribution of rainfall over the year as well, so that the preceding few months will be having a significant impact on what we're recording in that autumn time of the year. So we have these group 4 sites that were visited monthly. And here there were very significant differences over time. And the largest changes were at the end of the summer. So we're seeing this really big change in all of these different composition metrics at the end of summer. So mostly it's changes in September. For some of these metrics, there was also a small change in April or May in the year, at the start of the growing season, but the largest changes were definitely the end of the growing season. So starting to think this relates to the rainfall distribution over the year. So this at the end of summer, like all of the summer weathers were relatively dry, But then in 2020, there was also a very dry September, whereas in 2018, it was a much more normal September. So it was much wetter. We're trying to figure out what is causing these differences over time. And then within group 4, there was a paired reservoir and headwater. And so I was starting to look at the really molecular level organic matter, what's actually going on in these 2 sites, to then determine how that is impacted by changes in the catchment. And there were some trees by the reservoir that were felled at one point, so what impact that had. And then one of the advantages of mass spec is that you can start to look at the very individual compounds and see when they are occurring in the reservoir, and when they're occurring in the reservoir, but also which compounds occur just in the headwater or just in the reservoir. And the main takeaway from that is the headwater is much more diverse all year round. It's much more diverse than the reservoir. So the reservoir has generally very low diversity of organic matter. And I think even over 12 months of unique compound analysis, there was no month in the reservoir that had nearly as many as the headwater. So it's showing that headwater influence is very important with the land use in that headwater. And this is the main findings, that reservoirs are actually buffering the most extreme changes from this. So the seasonal changes were much less dramatic in the reservoir than they were in the headwaters. But this could be a significant problem with these changes after drought, because the changes in rainfall and temperature are impacting organic matter and producing more of these more difficult to treat compounds. So as drought is leading to more aromatic and less oxidized organic matter, which can be harder to treat, not necessarily more difficult to treat, I suppose, but if your water treatment works is already set up to treat organic matter that usually has a similar, more regular structure, and then drought is causing it to change, it can be that you need to invest more in your water treatment works to be able to deal with these incoming organic matters. Not only have the problem of drought, but also of the changes in timing of growing seasons over the years as the climate changes. So this is going to present quite a few difficulties for water companies. The third part of my project is sort of still ongoing, and I was looking at how the sort of getting even more onto a molecular level, looking at the microbes as well as the molecules in these systems. And this was 4 sites selected from that have been used in both the spatial and temporal studies. And these 4 reservoirs, so it's 4 reservoirs with 4 headwaters that flowed into them. And they were sampled in a paired study. So it's a simultaneous sampling at the headwater and reservoir. And we did this so the samples were taken every half an hour for 3 hours in the reservoir, and the same at the headwater. And at 4 sites, so we've got sort of a paired reservoir headwater, and then within this there were 2 sites where the headwater and reservoir are quite close together, and 2 sites where they're a bit further apart, and then 2 sites with similar land use at the headwater and reservoir, and 2 sites with more different land use. The analysis of this is ongoing, and as I said, it includes the water chemistry and organic matter composition with the mass spec, but also looking at the bacterial communities that are living in the headwaters and reservoirs. It's just a couple of examples of the sites. Ducks actually tried to take my lunch while I was doing this sampling. So there was 3 sites in Scotland and 1 in England looking. These are sites that were chosen in collaboration with water companies because they are particularly interested in some of these areas and some of these reservoirs particularly. So the top one there is a site where the headwater and reservoir are quite far apart. I think about 5 kilometers, and then the one at the bottom there is they're very close together, so it's less than a kilometer between this headwater and reservoir site. And then this is some very preliminary findings, so don't quote me on this yet. But this is looking at the different classes of bacteria found in these sites. Unfortunately, one headwater absolutely refused to yield any usable bacteria, even with 6 samples. So it was a bit frustrating, but we've got 3 headwaters here that show across these 3 sites that are relatively, they're not that close together geographically, but they've got quite similar populations of bacteria living in them. Generally, the larger the colour block, the more of that type of bacteria. So we've got quite a lot of this sort of orange and yellow and blue colours in this. And then when you compare that to the sites you're getting in the reservoir, again, there's a lot of the orange and blue, but there's a lot more dark green. It's not much purple. And all these sort of relate to different classes of bacteria. So you can start to see that there. So that's a headwater and a reservoir that are less than a kilometre apart, and they have this different community structures, their bacteria, which is interesting. And the next steps in this is to look at what these bacteria are actually doing, to figure out what compounds they're interacting with at the molecular level, so what they're actually changing, and if they're producing more of this organic matter that's uncoloured, or if they're converting organic matter to CO2 or methane, and what the impact of all this will be. So this has basically generated more questions than it's answered so far. And so there's a lot of things we don't know about what the bacteria are doing and what they're interacting with and how this impacts on the water chemistry overall. So in summary, this study has generally shown that catchment locations and features can help to steer water treatment methods, and implementing land use or vegetation cover changes, so for deforestation or changing land uses from a burnt to maybe an unburnt system could changes the organic matter composition, so could also reduce treatment costs. Water companies already know about carbon concentrations changing over time. They already know to expect this giant peak in autumn, but it does seem that the composition is also changing at the same time. So you're getting these large changes at the end of the growing season, and it could lead to it being more difficult to treat, or just a larger proportion of uncoloured organic matter. And changing climate will lead to water treatment challenges. And this last point is that different bacterial communities in reservoirs and headwaters. I'm not yet sure of the implications of that, but I'm working on it. And very briefly, I wanted to just talk about my very current work, which is looking at restoration on peat pools and that's impact on water chemistry. So I'm incorporating some of the methods I've been using at the wider scale to look at this more specifically at really small peatland pools, both natural and as a result of restoration projects. This will be running for the next 5 years. And so yeah, if you have any peatland restoration projects planned and you'd like to talk about peatland pools, to get in touch. And I'd like to thank everyone who's really helped with this, especially Sarah, Josh, and Fergus. Sarah and Josh kept a lot of this going through COVID and maternity leave, and Fergus is my constant fieldwork companion. So and thank you all for listening.
Thanks, Kat. That's great. So thanks to Ray and Kat for their brilliant presentations. We are going to go to the Q&A now.